So today I'm going to talk about Christopher Lasch in The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, particularly the parts of the first part of the book dealing with the American dream and the decline of civic virtue. The third chapter is entitled Opportunity in the Promised Land, and it has to do with the American dream. He says the American dream is one of social mobility, the idea that if you work hard enough, you'll be able to get ahead, and every individual in America has an equal opportunity and an equal chance of getting ahead, and one can go from rags to riches, basically, in America. But he does deal with this as a myth. He said there's this myth of the self-made man. And the American dream of social mobility is a double-edged sword. He says it does motivate people to try, and Lasch is concerned that individuals work hard and make efforts to improve their lot in life. But he also says it allows people to blame individuals entirely rather than placing blame on the system. Lasch doesn't want to entirely blame either one, I think. As I read more of this book, it's clear that he does feel very strongly about individual responsibility, and he doesn't like arguments, as we'll see a bit later, that get individuals off the hook in favor of some sort of squishy notion of relativism. But Lasch also thinks that there are problems that are built into the system, in particular the economy, that are outside of individuals' control and have quite a bit to do with the fate of people within that system. So he says, for instance, having internalized the myth of the self-made man, workers have too often sacrificed solidarity to the illusory hope of individual advancement. Worse, they have accepted a failure to advance as moral judgment on their own lack of ambition or intelligence. So I like that quote because it succinctly says, the working class has internalized this myth. It has bought into this myth of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, to the point where when they do not measure up, they blame themselves, their own lack of ambition or intelligence. But this, among other things, he's saying, gets in the way of their ability to actually work together, to help each other, to possibly work as a class. And this might mean anything from more effective labor organization to even just helping each other within their communities, so that they don't have to be so isolated. Later on in the book, he deals with communitarianism. And while he doesn't agree with all communitarian ideas, I think that the idea of people helping each other resonates and looms large in Christopher Lasch's view, because he laments the decline of real community. People have become, he says, isolated, atomized individuals, each responsible only for himself. And this weakens especially people in a precarious economic state who could really benefit from helping each other. But this myth of the self-made man works against that type of attitude towards life, of helping each other. He kind of gives a little bit of a history. He explains that in the 19th century, access to land narrowed. At first, as it looked like, as we pioneers went across the country and were more or less granted land or granted somebody else's land, there was this notion that there was so much abundance that would not run out, and that every person who wanted to could have their own land and at least feed themselves and hopefully grow that into something even more. But it wasn't long before those hopes were dashed. He says the hope behind the Homestead Act, as Wendell Berry puts it in The Unsettling of America, was that, quote, as many as possible should share in the ownership of the land and thus be bound to it by economic interests. by the investment of love and work, by family loyalty, by memory and tradition, end quote. In his 1859 speech to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society, the source of most of the statements I have been discussing, President Lincoln upheld a norm of intensive agriculture diametrically opposed to the wasteful migratory habits of those who saw land merely as a source of speculative profit. He condemned the ambition for broad acres, which encouraged careless, half-performed, and slovenly work. Well, and that gives you basically a feel for what was going on. A lot of grabbing up of land by speculators. And so not even before the 19th century was over, it became harder for families to actually just start up their own homestead and more or less provide for themselves. And this went on in the 20th century as small farms and businesses got outcompeted by larger and larger enterprises. We've talked about that phenomenon quite a bit on this channel. He says small property was disappearing, and for Christopher Lasch, without the ownership of small property being more readily available, a lot of people don't have the chance to have that sort of independence that it takes to have the mentality of a free citizen. As we know, then, also in the 20th century and ongoing, factory jobs, good factory jobs that paid a living wage, succumbed more and more to mechanization and to foreign labor, and threw more people into a class that's sometimes called the precariat. Now here's where Lasch really gets interesting. He starts talking in terms of what I would call two countries. He says, without small proprietorship in abundance, there remained the professional class, or the elites, and those who really were relegated to second-class citizenship. And actually, neither one of those classes needs a really good civic education, as we'll see in the next slide. But what he describes here is how that professional class starts to become detached from the rest of the people in the country. He says the growing insularity of elites means, among other things, that political ideologies lose touch with the concerns of ordinary citizens. He says that the elites would form left and right positions, but they would be talking amongst themselves. He talks about them as the talking classes. More and more they form these rigid ideological positions and talk to and against each other, and sealed themselves off from contradiction from their opponents, but more importantly from social reality. That is, both the elites left and right became sealed off more and more from the reality of the rest of the citizens in the country. So the liberal and conservative talking classes are out of touch, he's saying, with the rest of the country, because the loss of small proprietorship and decent blue-collar jobs doesn't affect them. They don't have any acquaintance with the impact of that, because they have risen up to this level of professional class, where they make their money from these types of professional jobs that are based upon a higher education. So we begin to see this vision of the country divided into these two classes living within their bubbles, living within their separate spheres, and really not knowing very much about the other. And Lasch is very concerned that you can't have a democracy that runs very well with this type of class divide. So he begins to talk about the decline of civic virtue. He says, contrary to the liberal position, democracies need civic virtue. When he uses the term liberal here, he means the classical liberal position. He explains that the classical liberal position is that we can devise our institutions well enough that the country could be run by devils rather than angels, as Madison said long ago, and it would it would still run smoothly. But in reality, Lasch says, you need citizens, voters, who understand more than their own self-interest and can think about the common good. But neither the elites, who have turned into the professional class, or the second class, who are moving into the sort of service class, receive a good civic education. None of them are property owners. They don't have a solid fixed stake in the political game in the same way that a property owner would. Their fates are tied up with employers, and oftentimes those employers are corporations where basically they don't know exactly who they're working for, or even suppose what country they're ultimately headquartered in. The education they receive, in other words, is to perform in a particular job. Then Lasch makes a move which I believe is his explanation for what we do in the absence of a good civic education leading to civic virtue. A good civic education will teach you what it means to be a citizen and on what basis your equality exists. Obviously, you can have economic inequality and still have political equality of sorts if people are equally involved and have equal power in the political process. As in, if, for instance, if each vote really weighs the same. But in the absence of the basis for that civic virtue, he says we have become relativists, and we have become relativists out of his desire to substitute something for the democratic equality that we lack. Relativism allows us to basically live and let live, to allow our fellow citizens to do whatever they want and to suffer anything they have to suffer without our interference. He says to refer everything to a plurality of ethical commitments means that we make no demands on anyone and acknowledge no one's right to make any demands on ourselves. The suspension of judgment logically condemns us to solitude. Unless we are prepared to make demands on one another, we can enjoy only the most rudimentary kind of common life. But you see, the equality that comes with relativism can't put demands on anyone else, because to put demands on them would be to make some sort of truth claim, to say that there is some sort of common set of values. We can't do that, and that's convenient. It allows us to basically drop our commitments to our fellow citizens. We don't have a common life. We don't have a common culture. He says, common standards are absolutely indispensable to a democratic society. Societies organized around a hierarchy of privilege can afford multiple standards, but a democracy cannot. Double standards mean second-class citizenship. So we come up with categories for people, and we put them into those categories, and then this places them into a sphere that we can't truly demand any change from. To ask them to become equal citizens almost would then seem like some sort of strange form of discrimination, and we don't do it. Hopefully this quote will make this point clear. He says, we have become too proficient in making excuses for ourselves. Worse, in making excuses for the, quote, disadvantaged, end quote. We are so busy defending our rights conferred for the most part by judicial decree, that we give little thought to our responsibilities. We seldom say what we think for fear of giving offense. We are determined to respect everyone, but we have forgotten that respect has to be earned. Respect is not another word for tolerance or the appreciation of alternative lifestyles and communities. This is a tourist's approach to morality. Respect is what we experience in the presence of admirable achievements, admirably formed characters, natural gifts put to good use. It entails the exercise of discriminating judgment, not indiscriminate acceptance. So to be clear, political correctness can become a way of wheedling out, of working towards true equality, because it is a sort of giving up on the idea of a common life and common democratic values and common standards. And while it may make the people who are politically correct feel good, it doesn't ultimately do a whole lot of good for the people on the other end. Political correctness is another emanation of the revolt of the elites. And political correctness is not true respect for other people, but a sort of condescension. Then Lasch turns his aim towards the capitalist market. Really, what he's taking aim at, but didn't use the term yet, is neoliberalism. It's almost the really post-capitalist market, when the market mentality has pervaded every sphere of life, and small business no longer exists in enough force to encourage independent thought. You get neoliberalism. He says, even liberal individuals require the character-forming discipline of the family, the neighborhood, the school, and the church, all of which, not just the family, have been weakened by the encroachments of the market. Think about that. The market has affected the family, the neighborhood, the school, the church. I mean, the market has made tremendous demands on the family, and the family has wrapped itself around the market in so many ways. Neighborhoods, they're places where you park your car. This is when Lasch starts sounding like a communitarian, places where you park your car and sleep at night. The school is all about forming students for the workplace. And the church, well, unfortunately, you may have noticed the churches act an awful lot like corporations these days. Too often it's about butts in the seats, and it's about the amount of contributions, and it's about the marketing plan. So he says the market notoriously tends to universalize itself. It does not easily coexist with institutions that operate according to principles antithetical to itself. Schools and universities, newspapers and magazines, charities, families. Sooner or later, the market tends to absorb all of them. It puts an almost irresistible pressure on every activity to justify itself in the only terms it recognizes, to become a business proposition, to pay its own way, to show black ink on the bottom line. It turns news into entertainment, scholarship into professional careerism, social work into the scientific management of poverty. Inexorably, it remodels every institution in its own image. If that isn't truth, I don't know what is. News into entertainment, scholarship into professional careerism, and social work into the scientific management of poverty. I don't think I need to elaborate. All right, I'll move into part 2 next time.